Welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us on this lovely Tuesday afternoon if you're in Auckland, like I am. Today we're joined by Sam Newton, who is one of PayHero's solution specialists, to be talking about the upcoming changes to the Holidays Act. So if you've been through these webinars or these Facebook Live sessions with us before, you'll be very comfortable with the structure by now. What we will be doing is covering off some housekeeping to start with, and then we will jump into the meat of the session today. So just to start off, Sam and I will be having a conversation about the upcoming changes to the Holidays Act. He is a Holidays Act expert, so I will be asking most of the questions and jumping in if I have any thoughts from an HR perspective. Once we've wrapped our kind of 15 to 20 minute conversation about the changes that are coming through, we'll go to a question and answer session, which we expect will be hotly followed and hotly answered. So if you do have any questions as we go through the session today, please just add them in the Q&A box on your screen and we will answer them all at the end. The session will be available afterwards on our MyHR Facebook page as well as the MyHR website. So if you miss anything, or if you have to duck off, or if you'd like to revisit some key sections that are relevant to you and your business, you'll certainly be able to do so. What that does mean is if you are asking questions, be aware that these will be answered publicly. So if you would like to remove identifying details, I'd suggest that you do so. We, of course, also do our best to make sure that we are not including any information that might not be appropriate for this forum. So chat session with Sam and Sylvie, question and answer session, and it will be available online afterwards if you do have to miss anything. So thank you once again for joining us. Post your questions as we go through and we'll get started. So welcome to Sam. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Sylvie. Good to be here. I'm just sorry I couldn't have been up there in person up at the summit. It was just a shame that had to get cancelled, but we're nearly out of those COVID days. So yeah,
the vaccines are coming. The border workforce has taken over. So we're certainly really looking forward to hosting the MyHR Summit in person. We were really gutted that we had to cancel. It was it was going to be a fantastic event, but technology saves the day. So we're really glad we can host the series instead, so people can get some of the useful information that we would have been sharing at the summit. So we'll meet in person next time, I'm sure. So we'll kick off with our questions. Sam, the Holidays Act has been in place since 2003. So why are we talking about changes to the Holidays Act now?
Yeah, true. In fact, it's been really in place longer than that to a certain degree. It was way back in 1944 that leave was given to people. Initially, people were given 2 weeks leave, and they had the option of taking those 2 weeks together or taking 2 chunks of 1 week at a time, which wasn't particularly flexible as we know it. But that's sort of where things started, where Holidays Act started. That got reviewed in 1974 and we got 3 weeks. And then we got, at the same time, we got average rates and ordinary rates. So lots of the little bits that we've got now have come from right back then. 1981. There were a lot of changes, and 2003, added more on. It just kept adding more on, but really, what we're dealing with has been gradually evolving for 80 years now, and that's the first part of the problem, right? Where things have changed a lot since then. We're a lot more flexible in our working hours, working patterns, and so some of those concepts from back then just aren't relevant, and yet they've sort of hung around. So you've got the legislation evolving rather than ever sort of being cut off and replanted. At the same time, you've got case law. You've got every now and then a clarification will come up in court, and they'll go, well, yes, sure, everybody's been doing it this way, but really what the law says is that you should be doing it this way. So on top of just the change to the law, you've got that factor being folded in. Back in 2011, there was a payroll specification done by the New Zealand Payroll Practitioners Association in conjunction with what was the Department of Labour back then. And that encapsulated the way a lot of people thought of leave back then. It talked about accruing hours or accruing days of annual leave, and accruing it on a basis of 4/52 of the hours worked or the days worked. And that's the way most payroll systems worked at that time. And we're only talking 10 years ago. 80% of payroll systems back then were processing annual leave in terms of hours and keeping balances in hours and so on. And then around about 2015, 2016, government departments started having a little bit of a closer look at their payroll systems. And ironically, MB themselves were caught out, and they discovered that the way they had been doing things wasn't to the letter of the law. The way that whole hourly and daily and so on, that's a really intuitive way of thinking about leave, and that's the way most employees think about leave. It's the way a lot of employers think about leave. It's not the way it's defined in the Holidays Act. And so that kicked off a whole heap of reviews of people's payroll systems across the private sector and the public sector. And there have been tens, probably hundreds of millions of dollars spent, partly in investigating the problems and fixing the systems, and partly in reparations to employees. And and some of them are still hanging around. There's still the district health boards who are looking sort of 2/3 of $1 billion worth of cost to get that sorted out. So with all that going on, it was decided it was time for a review. Now, it's not the first time we've had a review. We had one back in 2009. The review back in 2009 was pretty much just unions and employers arguing. The concepts that were put to that review were really, really great. Some really good ideas about standardizing the rates. There was just one way of calculating all the different leave types and so on. But there was really no agreement that could be reached just between those two parties. There were a few things introduced in the amendments in 2011, but pretty much the main one was really just average daily rate for your BAPS, for your FBAPS holidays. Now, when I talk about FBAPS, I'm talking about everything that's not annual leave. So family violence, sick leave, alternatively public holiday sick leave. They introduced a new rate for doing that. That was a 12-month average. There weren't really many other changes, but that sort of changes in itself is enough for payroll companies like ourselves to have a look at their payroll systems and make some changes. So now with the 2018 review, one of the key things is that there were three parties involved. There's the employee representatives, employer representatives, and some government representatives in there as well. So I think that it was a good approach to try to get more agreement on more drastic change than what we had back in the 2009, which was a bit of a failure really as far as reviews go, and certainly as far as output of them goes.
Sure. And interesting too that the three parties this time around have led to some quite interesting changes to the law, and we'll dive into that in more detail shortly. So talking about the review itself, you've covered off the history of paid leave in New Zealand, which is really helpful to know when trying to understand why the law is the way it is. In terms of results from this review, in your opinion, what are some of the positive outcomes?
Yeah, from my point of view, I've got two hats that I'm wearing here. So on one side, I'm a shareholder in a payroll company. Mm-hmm. So I like to see good change coming through. That's going to be good in a payroll situation. On the other hand, I have to help people with leave issues every day. And from that point of view, I'm a little bit underwhelmed at some of the changes. So I would have loved for the review to come up with a totally new system about how things can be managed, but that just wasn't really realistic. It would be great if leave was something you could manage on a spreadsheet that everybody could do nice and easily and everybody could understand. But because we're coming from a point of view of where we've got a whole lot of legislation in place already, people have got leave balances based from one approach. And also, one of the key points with the review was that no one should be disadvantaged. And that really does, tie your hands behind your back when you're doing a review. And so while I would have loved it to have been a dramatic change, it's not really realistic. And so what we've got, it fills in a lot of the gaps, and it's certainly going to help. So as far as some of the good things in the Act, one of the first things that it talks about is clearly defining the units in which leave is to be tracked. So it clearly says that annual leave has to be tracked in weeks, not just tracked in weeks, but it's one of the things in the Act, in the review, is putting more detail into employee payslips. And one of the things that will be on everyone's payslips will be an annual leave balance, and that balance will be shown in weeks, which is an interesting one because most employers expect to show it in hours and days. So it's really clarifying that, and days for the FBAPs, for those other leave types. Now, that's actually the way it is now. There's nothing changing there at all. That's the way, or at least that's the way that the latest guidance from MB that came out in 2017 really does make it quite clear that that's the way things should be. And most payroll companies, including ourselves, have or are about to make that change. You're moving everything into that sort of standard. But it's good to have it really codified, really clearly defined, and no uncertain terms. There's a couple of good things that are getting removed. Parental leave is quite complex when someone comes back from parental leave, because any leave that they become entitled to while they were away gets paid out on a totally different basis to the rest of the leave. Well, not totally, but distinctly enough that it needs to be kept separately, and causes confusion. That's been removed. So if you're coming back from parental leave now, you'll just get paid annual leave the same as if you had never been on parental leave. Now, we actually had, I'm going to jump into a question that we had emailed in before. Someone asked, well, what happens then if after 12 months of parental leave, the person doesn't want to come back to work? Do they have to get paid out all those 4 weeks that they might have got during that time? If someone doesn't come back to work after parental leave, you treat their finish date as if it's when they last worked. So everything gets shifted back. So that's not an issue. However, if they came back and worked for a week and then decided they couldn't cope without seeing their child, full time, and they decided they weren't going to continue, well, that raises all sorts of interesting questions. And that's exactly the sort of point that's worth bringing up at the select committee stage. These sorts of cases and scenarios need to be raised, because while there's been a lot of testing done as part of this review, I think there are a lot of fringe cases that haven't yet been considered, and that's a really good example of one. Another thing that's been removed is the close downs. So this is where you're closing down over Christmas, and anyone who has been there for less than a year just gets paid out a big chunk of 8%. It's a really strange one that can result in weird things happening, such as if you just close down between New Year's and Christmas and you employ someone in January, you can potentially have them working almost 2 years for you with them only being able to take a couple of days leave. So just that's another one that just has been hanging around from the days when people weren't expected to take leave in advance, and it should have been taken out in 2003, if not 2011. So it's good to see that going. And around that same sort of area, some other pragmatic changes, such as allowing people to take leave in advance, right? There was no obligation previously for people to be able to take leave in their first year, but let's face it, pretty much every employer lets people take leave as they need it or as they've got it due to them. Particularly because that keeps the liability off the books, and it's crazy to have someone working for a whole year without taking any leave. So that's been put into law, and similarly, sick leave you can now take in a quarter day or a half a day. So that's been sort of cleaned up a bit as well. I mentioned before that pay slips are now mandatory, and they're going to have a huge amount of detail. Even one of the things that's been proposed is that even it will show the hours per day that you've worked. So a full basically timesheet summary as part of your pay slip. So that's quite a dramatic change for companies that have a separate time recording system to where their payroll system is. Getting all that information together is going to be quite a challenge for a lot of companies. And another thing on those pay slips will be sick leave. A lot of companies choose not to show sick leave because they sort of don't want their employees to think they can take it for some reason. But now they're going to have to have it on those pay slips.
Sure.
Yeah. And I suppose another couple of things that are getting codified, rules about otherwise working days. How do you work out if this is a day that someone would normally have worked if their hours and days are variable? And they're putting rules in place in that with that. We've had rules that we've built into our products, a review period and how many Mondays have they worked over the last X weeks, that's been put into a rule, which is basically 50% of the last 4 weeks or 50% of the last 13 weeks. So those sorts of things are going to be good to have standardized, rather than essentially people making up rules that they think suits their industry, but don't really know until the labour inspector comes along and has a look at it. So it's going to be good to have that surety around those things. Yeah, so those are a few of, I suppose, my favourite points of what's coming in the review.
Sure. And it's quite an exhaustive list, hey, when you think about the fact that they are codifying some requirements, changing pieces around annual close downs, making it clear what people can take in terms of leave in advance. Although it's not, as you say, a massive overhaul of the system, it's certainly tinkering across a lot of different areas that the Holidays Act covers. So it's important that we're going to be able to get it right.
Yeah, there's going to be a lot of work for the people writing the legislation, but I think that the approach with this legislation rewrite will be a little bit more modern, and that it will have things like examples actually in the legislation. So that will be good to have as well.
Oh, fantastic. Cool. So we've just covered off some of the positive outcomes of the review. On the flip side, in your view, what are some of the negative outcomes, or perhaps things that weren't taken far enough?
Yeah, so if you worked two days a week last year, now you're working 5 days a week. What was happening last year is irrelevant. When you take a week's leave, it's 5 days. So whereas if you were accruing leave, you wouldn't have got 4 lots of 5 days to take this year, because some of those 2 days would have given you less leave. So that's the way people used to think it would work, but in actual fact it doesn't. The leave gets evaluated when you take it. So that's why it's important to have leave stored in weeks rather than any other units, because those other units won't automatically adjust. Now, there was strong support in the submissions to change to more of an accrual approach, to change to using hours. And they ran tests through those approaches, and they decided against them. And I think that once again, it's that whole not disadvantaging people. And the key is that person who's gone from 2 days to 5 days, which is a bit odd, because going the other way, you have someone is disadvantaged essentially. If you're thinking in terms of banking your annual leave. Yeah, so that's one thing that I suppose is a little bit disappointing, that wasn't given an overhaul, but you can totally see why. There's also the other thing that sort of is a little bit odd about not going down that accrual approach is that we are now letting people take leave in advance as if it had been accrued. So now we've still got this artificial 12-month anniversary where someone's 8% of holiday pay gets converted into 4 weeks leave. That's kind of a little bit arbitrary, really, nowadays. We've also got accrual with sick leave. So one of the changes that's been introduced is that rather than waiting for 6 months before you get your 5 days a year of sick leave, you get 1 day the day you start, and then you get another day the next month. So we are now accruing sick leave, and yet we're not doing the same with annual leave. So yeah, it's just a little bit of a, I suppose it's a hangover from the way things have been done in the past, and that's still going to be hanging around. I'll just show you an example. I'm just going to share my screen here and show you an example where you get some weird things happening, and it's like that example I've just been discussing with you. Here we go. Right. So let's. So what we're going to look at here is the payout for someone whose work patterns have changed. So we've got Mary, who earns $40 an hour, does 8 hours per day, and she's working 2 days per week. But then after 6 months, she changes up to 5 days per week. And so then in the 10th month, Mary's been working there for 3/4 of a year, so she can take 3 weeks leave, because of the way that the review was talking about being able to take leave in advance. So she's paid $4,800 for those 3 weeks. That's great. Now, if she came back, worked for a week or two, and then resigned, some weird things start to happen. So when you resign, or when you leave a job in your first 12 months, you just get paid out 8% of all your gross earnings. And any leave that you've taken in advance has to get paid back. So in this case, she'd have to pay back $4,800, but her 8% is only $3,400 because of that period where she was earning less. So in her final pay, she owes the company $1,400. Now, she's not going to be very happy with that. Company's not going to be very happy with that, and they may not even get it back. So, so that's a bit of a weird situation. And just extending a bit further, let's say she stayed on until just before her leave anniversary. So she's pretty much accrued as much of her leave as she can, but she's still just taking those 3 weeks. If she left at that point, her 8% has gone up, but she's still in the negative territory. So she would, in that final pay, she would owe the company $140. But if she rolled forward to the next week and she crossed her leave anniversary, suddenly all her 4 weeks become due. So that 3 weeks she's taken advance gets wiped out. The 8% gets removed. And so she ends up with 1 week of leave. So if she worked a week longer, she would now receive $1,730. So that's a difference of $1,840, just depending on whether they leave 1 week before or 1 week after the leave anniversary. Now, this is the sort of thing that I was hoping that the Holidays Act would, totally stamp out. In the terms of reference, there was talk about perverse incentives, about removing perverse incentives. But with the complexity that's still in there, I think there are still a lot of opportunities for these perverse incentives to still hang around. And that's confusing. That's confusing for everyone, that sort of thing. What else? So, and it's really hard for some industries, like labour hire companies.
I'm just going to jump in, Sam. You're still sharing your screen. Did you want us to have all those notes visible at the same time?
What is that?
Mm-hmm. There we go. That's you again.
Cool. So labour hire companies, for example, where they might employ someone for 4 weeks, and then there's no work, there's no assignment for them for 3 weeks, and then they're on again. That the complexity with having that standard annual sort of entitlement is quite tricky.
Mm.
So I mentioned that annual leave is going to be stored in weeks. So as a result of that, there needs to be a lot of stuff added to legislation to work out what a week is. And that's one of the things that's one of the major parts of this review is putting in formulas for how you're going to work that out for people with irregular days and irregular hours. Now, the problem with this is that it's complex. So what they're talking about doing is having you look back over the last 13 weeks for each day of the week that someone's taking leave. So let's say someone took sick leave on a Monday and a Tuesday. The first thing you'd have to do is look back over the last 13 Mondays and work out what the average number of hours they did on a Monday. Then you do the same thing on a Tuesday. Then you need to look back over the whole 13 weeks and work out what the average hours per week is for the whole period. Then you need to look back over 13 weeks and work out what the average weekly pay was, and then you need to divide the average hours for each of the days into the average hours for the week, and do a proportion of the earnings of that. Now, I've been through that quickly just to show you how confusing it is. If you look at it on paper, it makes sense, and a computer program is going to be able to handle that just fine. But if you're wanting to do your leave calculations on the kitchen table, it's just not going to work, right? The other thing that it clarifies in the Act is just what earnings go into the calculations. So there's been sort of confusion about whether a 6-month commission should get applied to what rates, and what about a Christmas bonus, and what about bonuses that are kind of discretionary but kind of not. So the way things are heading is everything that someone earns, if it's not a reimbursement for expenses, everything else is going to go towards the leave calculations. At least that's the initial plan. So that's something to consider if you're giving your staff a Christmas bonus. You might want to drop it a little bit because they're going to get extra benefit from that Christmas bonus in their leave rates or in their 8%. There are already some exceptions to that. So if you're getting annual leave cashed in, I think that's going to be an exception. The leave calculations will now be the average over 12 months compared with the average over 13 weeks. And if you have some sort of bonus that doesn't fit into that 13-week period, well, that's still going to be an exception. So they've tried to simplify it, but it hasn't quite gone all the way. There's still going to be the need to be able to tweak your pay items for some to be included and some to be not. So yeah. How are we going for time? We're just about there. Holiday pay as you go has been really trimmed down. So that's if you just pay out people 8% with their pay. You're no longer going to be able to do it just because someone is going to be employed for less than 12 months. And I think the reason for that is because people can now take leave in advance. That it's sort of an old requirement that's been done away with. But the other current reason for doing it is if people work intermittent or irregular hours, and that has now been made a lot more strict. You now need to review what they're working every 13 weeks and prove that that's still the case. And yep, I think that's good in many cases, but there are some cases where it seems a little bit onerous. We were talking to someone last week who has someone they employ for 2 hours every second Tuesday. And for someone like that, the concept of 4 weeks leave just doesn't make any sense. You know, what is a week? How does it fit into that 2-week pattern? The more you think about that example, the more you get tied up in knots. So, you know, I'd like to see some sort of dispensation for cases like that, where it just doesn't make sense to have 4 weeks, that you could still use that 8% approach. I mean, it's beneficial to both the employee and the employer. So, yeah. So, yeah, that's a bit of a run through the changes and what's good and what's bad.
And even working in this industry myself and advising clients on a daily basis about the Holidays Act, there's clearly a lot that is going to be changing, and clearly some work that we're going to need to put into preparing ourselves and making sure that we are compliant with the new way of doing things so that we can assist our clients to be compliant. So thinking ahead through these changes, do we have a timeline for when they'll take effect?
Well, there's a lot of work to be done. It has to be, the law needs to be written, then it needs to go through the whole parliamentary process. And even when it comes out, I'm sure they're going to give quite a lot of leeway, because it's going to take quite a while for every payroll system in New Zealand to become compliant again. So yeah, there are years in advance. But there are some things that you can start looking at now. All right. If you're not already recording leave in weeks or saving a balance of leave in weeks, you should really be moving over to that. You probably want to look at your contracts around how you define what a week is, and this is where you guys at MyHR are all over that. Making sure that the contract's going to suit the current legislation and the future legislation. Look, yes, but it's not law yet, so you can't. So don't go asking your payroll company why they can't calculate a 13-week daily average yet. We've got a fair bit of work to do there. So there is going to be a lot of work for payroll companies, and there's even some of the work is even going to be removing things which we spent hours putting in, which is always a bit depressing for us. All the hard work on close down and sick leave rules and so on. We're just going to have to strip all those out. So there's a few things you can start looking at, and possibly some of those ideas that they propose for things like otherwise working day, where there's a dearth of any sort of real rules at the moment. You can maybe start looking at those at this stage. As we get further down the track, that's when you'll need to start asking hard questions of your payroll company and see where they're going. But ultimately, your payroll company should be able to provide you updates, and it should be a fairly seamless exercise if you're fully compliant with the Act now. But if you're not, you've got some work to do anyway.
Fantastic, thank you. Well, that was a lot of content for our viewers and for ourselves and our clients to get our heads around. So what I will do is open up the floor to questions that come through from people who might be watching this webinar or who might have logged on Facebook Live. So if you are watching, please pop your questions through either in the chat in the question and answer function or on Facebook in the comments if you are watching. We'll take a very, very short break while I review and gather those questions so I can put them to Sam. So stay with us. We'll just stop talking for a couple of minutes, but it's not because the line is cut out. We're just making sure we've got all your questions in one place.
I guess while that's happening, I'll just give a quick little summary.
Yeah, of course.
I think if you were heading off to Mars on one of Elon Musk's spaceships, and you had 6 months and you were trying to work out what policies you were going to put in place when you got to Mars, and you got around to holidays, you wouldn't be looking at the New Zealand Holidays Act and saying that's a great idea, we should start there. What we have got, it has been built on and built on and built on. It's going to do its job really well. It to meet the intent of the Act, which is giving people 4 weeks leave of annual leave, giving people the right amount of sick leave and so on. But it's just, I suppose it's just not done in an elegant and simple way. So perhaps it's not as brave as I would have liked, but realistically, I think they've done all they can. There has been a question come through on the chat rather than the Q&A. About how do you make submissions. Well, that's not an area I'm an expert of, but it's just part of the parliamentary process when it goes through select committee. And yeah, I really encourage you to get in there and take some of your juicy scenarios to the select committee and make sure they get heard. So yeah, definitely get involved in that process. We've got someone here asking, when will it become compulsory to record annual leave weekly? So to record your balance in weeks. Well, that's really the way it is now. It's the way it's highly recommended. So one place to go to look at for some of this information is the Holidays Act guidance document from 2017 that MB put out. And I think the way they put it is they strongly recommend that in order to be compliant, you record annual leave in weeks. So at this stage, it's strongly recommended. But yeah, this is going to really make that make it hard and fast.
Great, thanks, Sam. We've had a few questions come through on the Q&A. Saman asks, what would be the best platform where the Holidays Act review or question and answers can be published so that we can access the upcoming info? So Suman, the MyHR team will be working really hard along with PayHero over the next couple of years to keep you updated on progress. The question and answers that we answer here on this webinar will be available in the video recording afterwards. If you Google search MB Holidays Act review, there is a 2-page PDF document that has most of these changes summarised. What I'll do is post a link to that in the webinar section once we finish, and I'll also post it in the comments on the Facebook Live video as well, so that's the place to go. An anonymous question has come through. For otherwise working days, if you have part-time permanent employees who have stated days and hours in their employment agreement, what's the likelihood that these will need to be confirmed in terms of a timesheet, for example, to determine what days are worked for leave calcs, when currently they are viewed as salaried workers on agreed part-time hours? Sam, I'll hand that one over to you.
Right, yeah, there's a lot in that. So for an otherwise working day, the first point of reference is still, so remember, this isn't law yet. This has just a review, but the impression I get from the review is that the first point of contact is still going to be your contract, what it says in there. There is a little bit that's been snuck in the review where if someone's hours over the last 13 weeks vary by 20% or more from what their agreed contract is, then you need to use their actual hours for the calculations, for the purpose of the calculations of the rates. So that's a little bit of an obscure little thing that's not on the fact sheet, that's just sort of buried in the review. So yeah, so that's as far as working out how much people will get paid for those days. As far as working out your otherwise working day, yeah, the first point of contact is what their contracted hours are, and I think that's, and if their work is varying quite a lot from that, then yeah, I can't really give an answer of which will trump the other, because it's just going to vary from situation to situation.
Understood, thank you. And that was everything that we had come through on the Q&A. Now that we've gone through that content in a bit more detail, Sam, could I get you to revisit that question that came through around employees resigning at the end of their parental leave period, now that we've gone through some of the other changes and what flow-on effects that might have?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so when someone leaves at the end of their parental leave, they don't come back to work at all, then their last day is considered the last day before they went on parental leave. Okay, so the changes to the parental leave won't affect that scenario. If they come back and they do two weeks work and then they take a week's leave, that's where things will change, because under the current scenario, if they come back, if they say they've been away for 12 months, they come back and they work for a couple of weeks and then they go away, they get paid at the average over the last 12 months, which is very, very small. They've only done 2 weeks, so they get paid almost nothing for that leave. And so that's what's changing now. Instead, they'll get paid their full ordinary pay rate. And that's actually, there's a whole new term. Well, it's a, I suppose, a morphing of existing terms. That's the ordinary leave pay. Which is what someone would have earned had they have worked on the day, and that's I suppose that's another issue. Another thing I'm not entirely happy with. That term is still a little bit amorphous. It's still a little bit hard to really. It's not based on a formula, and as someone who's done computer programming, I like it when there's a formula rather than just a bit of guesswork around what they would have earned, especially when there are things like commission involved, or when people's in hospitality, for example, where your hours are going to vary basically based on patronage. If there are still people ordering drinks, it determines whether the bar stays open. And so what other people have worked on the same day might be irrelevant to what you've worked. So that ordinary weekly pay becomes a bit of a troublesome term, I think, but we'll see how that goes. So anyway, so back to the parental leave. So yeah, they've been there for 2 weeks. They take a week off. Yes, they'll get paid the full amount. If they were to then leave and they've got a whole lot of another 3 weeks of leave sitting there, the review is silent on what happens to that. And I think that's something where there needs to be a different rule. It doesn't really make sense for someone to be paid out a huge amount of leave when they've only been working, 3 weeks when they came back. So yeah, that's the sort of thing that would be good to, hopefully when they get down to the brass tacks, they'll resolve that.
Absolutely. And another question has come through on the parental leave front. With parental leave, can you refuse someone's application for annual leave if they want to take leave too soon after they return? The argument would be, why would they need leave after having 12 months off? So my comment to that would be, although I don't think 12 months off to raise a newborn human is necessarily time off as such, you can certainly decline requests for annual leave. So it's always to be taken at the agreement of the employee and employer. So if you wanted to turn down someone's leave request after they've come back from parental leave, you certainly could. At least that would be my response. In the old world, Sam, I take it that those rules haven't changed.
I think it's going to be harder to do that. For example, certainly with taking leave in advance, it's not as previously the employer could just pretty much turn down leave in advance, but that's now becoming, I think, they need to have a very good reason to turn it down. I think that would be the key. If you don't have a very good reason to turn it down, and I suppose the other thing is that when someone's coming back from parental leave and they've been working with you for 2 weeks, they may actually have a very good reason to take some annual leave. They might have a child that's got issues, or it's a tricky time. So I think it'd be. I'm not an employment lawyer, so don't take this as employment law advice. So just from a point of view of someone who deals with a lot of leave, I think you'd certainly have to have a good reason for refusing it, not just you've only been back 2 weeks. I don't think that would suffice as a good enough reason. Yeah.
Sure. Thank you. And next question is also answered anonymously. Do you think the changes will have a knock-on effect, the changes to the Holidays Act, when it comes to working out whether designated casual employees are truly casual employees?
It's just a lot harder to call them casual now. I think is the key. And that 13-week review, there's 4 points that need to be covered off. I can't remember exactly what they are, but just around the regularity of the work. So you need to go through that review every 13 weeks to keep them on holiday pay as you go. So assuming that's what you mean by casual, if you're sort of referring to that holiday pay as you go, which is what it generally means in terms of the Holidays Act. So it's certainly going to be a lot harder. You're not just going to be able to set and forget people. So yeah.
From an HR practice point of view as well, we often find that the set and forget approach is the one that's commonly taken because businesses get busy. Running a business is hard work at the best of times, and having to keep on top of this kind of stuff often sinks to the bottom of people's piles. Yeah. I was interested to see that there is now a requirement every 13 weeks to review whether your casuals still fall into that bucket, because it's going to be quite a change in practice for a lot of the businesses that we deal with, for sure, to see what the compliance outcomes are of that. I'd be quite interested to follow up on.
And it's even proposed that is shown on the payslips. that the review is actually even outlined on the payslip. So it's going to be quite strict around that.
Full on. Cool. Next question, did the review cover the number of annual leave days that can be cashed out within 12 months? So currently employees can ask for 1 week of their holiday entitlement to be cashed out each year. So is that in the scope of the review?
No changes to that in this. No changes. That the actual that cashing in was actually way back in one of the small things that came out of the previous review back in 2009. But yeah, nothing's been looked at that for this one.
Thank you. A question from Russell. Russell asks, I'm looking at new employment agreements for a new company. Would it be best to use legacy ones for now in anticipation that the new rules are not yet solidified to make sure that we can change the format and content and keep it accurate?
This is for you, Sylvie.
Yes. So like Sam was saying earlier, it's strongly recommended that currently you track your annual leave in weeks, not in hours or days. So if you aren't doing that at the moment, that would be a really easy piece of what we expect to be in the new law to start doing in your business and your employment agreements now. Certainly it depends on how old your legacy agreements are. If you haven't looked at them in the last 12 months, I strongly recommend that you do so. And that's part of the MyHR service, is that we are always keeping to the front of these employment law changes and making changes to your employment documents as we need to. So if you are with us and are a client currently, that's a part of our process. You can take that worry off your hat. But if it's something that you aren't doing and you're still using employment agreements from 12 months ago, 2 years ago, 10 years ago, you'll really need to get some expert advice to look at those, because things like the the Health and Safety at Work Act have changed. The family violence legislation come into effect. There are changes around trial periods, around hours at work. So I strongly recommend you get some advice if you haven't done so already. Next question, Sarah asks, do we have an indication of time frame for these laws to come into effect? Are we thinking around 1 to 2 years longer?
Yeah, look, it's hard to. It's a bit of a how long is a piece of string. I think the lip service has been given about this being a priority to get through, but I think it's going to be so complex that there are going to be some pretty involved submissions to the select committee. There'll be a lot of reviews being done, and as I was saying, there's going to have to be a good length of lead time, even once the law is passed. So yeah, 2 years I would think would be minimum. But,
and my understanding was it was going to select committee in 2022, so it hasn't even got to the first stage of that parliamentary process yet. We're still in the discussions and beginning phases of that process.
That's right. It's a long way down the track.
Cool. Next question. This is possibly quite a long answer, so we'll see how much of it we can get to. How will a week's leave be calculated when a person works fluctuating hours that are generally higher than their guaranteed minimum hours?
Yeah, so that's the whole 13-week average, and it's done on a day-by-day basis. Yeah, I can't really describe it without going into a monologue like I did before. It involves looking at the average for each day of the week, each individual day of the week over the last 13 weeks. So yeah, so it's quite involved to really get an accurate view of what the pattern is. Yeah, so jump into that. The fact sheet you were talking about before, Sylvie, that has just a very short thing talking about the average over the last 13 weeks. If you really want to see it, you actually need to go right into the review document, and that's got a flow chart that's got all the different, that's got the calculations, and it takes a little bit to get your head around it, but yeah, it does make sense, and hopefully it's nothing you'll have to think about because your payroll system will do it all for you.
Perfect, thank you. D asks, is there going to be any clear determination of a casual employee, or is it still based on their past 6-month work pattern? So my first reaction to that is it's not currently based on their last 6-month work pattern. There are some different measurements in place, but I'll hand over to you, Sam, to talk about what this 13-week review, particularly for casual employees, is likely to throw up.
Yes, 13-week. I think that's the key thing. 13 weeks and those 4 points. And I look, I can't remember off the top of my head. So once again, jump into the review if you want to know about if you've got a lot of casual employees. Remembering it's not going to take effect for a while, but jump in there and have a look at those 4 points that you need to ensure. It involves things like whether they can turn down work, whether they've had a week without doing any work. So the impression I get is if over the last 13 weeks they've worked every week, well, then you need to start looking at not paying out the 8%. It's a lot harder to use that 8%, which, as I said, yeah, it's good for some, I suppose, vulnerable employees, but there's a lot of sort of cases where it's just a pragmatic solution to a weird pattern that's no longer going to be available.
And we're getting to some of these questions where we have touched on them or answered them already. So I'm just mindful of time. I'll skip to ones that cover content that we haven't spoken to yet. An anonymous question: if someone works a half day as part of their standard 40 hours per week and they take sick leave on that day, do you pay 1 day's sick leave or half a day's sick leave?
So in the current legislation, doesn't tell you which way to go. There's no indication there, but that has been made much more certain in the review. So you can do full day, half day, or even down to a quarter day. So I imagine a 3/4 day as well. Yeah, so that's one of the key changes that they're putting through. That's one of the things I like, where they're making it absolutely clear that people can take a half day sick leave if they need to. Yeah.
Great, thank you. And so far, last question to come through: are there any changes in respect to fixed term employment agreements? And the answer will be yes, because I think they've stopped the pay-as-you-go applying to fixed term agreements of under 12 months. Did I read that right in the document?
That's right. Yep. That's right. They can't, and the reason for that is, as I said before, is because now that you can take leave in advance, that the main reason for having that 8% paid out was potentially someone would never get to take their leave, because way back when those laws were put together, it was sort of considered unusual for people to take leave in their first year for some strange reason, and so that's sort of been superseded now by the ability to take leave in advance, and so yeah, that's what's happening there. Yeah, there's also someone that's asked, when someone leaves and has leave paid out, is the 13-week rule still in play? So the 13 weeks is getting used in a couple of different places. So it's replacing the ordinary pay calculation, which is 4 weeks at the moment. Okay, so when someone gets paid out 3 weeks leave because they're leaving, they're going to get it paid out at the highest rate of their last 12 months, or their last 13 weeks, or what they regularly get. So that 13-week will still apply, but it's not the calculation looking at individual days. It's not going to be doing that calculation. So that's only when you take leave. So the leave is connected to a specific day. Yeah.
Great. Thank you. And I believe that is all our questions, unless someone was to come through with a Hail Mary at the 11th hour. So we'll wrap it up there, given it's now 10 to 2. Just a quick summary piece then, Sam, from my side. What I've taken away from this session is that there is the opportunity to give feedback on the changes that the review has drawn up through the select committee process. That will start next year. But at the moment, the changes that the review has recommended that will be drafted into a draft piece of legislation are wide-ranging in terms of the prescriptiveness that they will bring to some aspects of the Holidays Act. There are some mechanisms which are changing, and there are some ways entitlements are being managed which will be different. So although there's a lot to get our heads around, it's certainly not a reinventing of the Holidays Act as such. It's very much changing the existing mechanisms that are there. So that's been my takeaway. Did you have anything to add that you think it would be important for our audience to know today?
Yeah, that's exactly right. I suppose, as far as another thing you can start looking at is just making sure you've got your timesheets under control. At some stage, you're going to need to have good, accurate timesheet information tied into your payroll system so that it can do all the necessary calculations. If you've got people on variable work patterns, or who have different bonus payments, commission payments, and so on, where it's going to need that. No, I think that's a good summary. Sorry if I threw a lot out there in a short period of time. I tried to cram as much as I could into that half an hour. So sorry if it was a little bit fast for you, but hopefully you've got something out of it.
Well, and the value of doing this online and not in a live in-person format is the recording is available afterwards. So if something Sam or I said piqued your interest, if there's anything you would like to go back and listen to again, if you have questions to send through after we wrap up the session today, you're very welcome to do so. We've got a lot of lead time before these changes take effect, but it's really good to get your head around as a business owner what changes you could be making in 2021 and 2022 to perhaps make 2023 Sylvie's life easier, or 2023 Sam's life easier, because as business owners we want to get it right from the get-go. So we'll wrap up there. A massive thanks again to Sam for joining us today as our solution specialist from PayHero. A thank you to all of you for giving up some of your time and coming and spending the afternoon with us. Again, this session will be available on Facebook and on the MyHR website once we've wrapped up. Any questions, do send them through to help@myhr.works. But again, thank you all so much, and we look forward to seeing you at the next one. We'll talk to you soon.